Transfiguration of Jesus. The Transfiguration of Jesus is a story told in the New Testament when Jesus is transfigured and becomes radiant in glory upon a mountain. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew 17, 1-8, Mark 9, 2-8, Luke 9, 28-36 described it, and the second epistle of Peter also refers to it, 2 Peter 1, 16-18. It has also been hypothesized that the first chapter of the Gospel of John alludes to it, John 1:14. In these accounts, Jesus and three of his apostles, Peter, James, and John, go to a mountain, the Mount of Transfiguration, to pray. On the mountain, Jesus begins to shine with bright rays of light. Then the prophets Moses and Elijah appear next to him, and he speaks with them. Jesus is then called Son by a voice in the sky, assumed to be God the Father, as in the baptism of Jesus. The Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Anglican churches commemorate the event in the Feast of the Transfiguration, a major festival. So what is the significance of the Transfiguration to Christian theology? The Transfiguration is one of the miracles of Jesus in the Gospels. This miracle is unique among others that appear in the canonical Gospels, in that the miracle happens to Jesus himself. Thomas Aquinas considered the Transfiguration the greatest miracle, in that it completed baptism and showed the perfection of life in heaven. The Transfiguration is one of the 5 major milestones in the Gospel narrative of the life of Jesus, the others being baptism, crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. In 2002, Pope John Paul II introduced the luminous mysteries in the Rosary, which includes the Transfiguration. In Christian teachings, the Transfiguration is a pivotal moment. The setting on the mountain is represented as the point where human nature meets God, the meeting place of the temporal and the eternal, with Jesus himself as the connecting point, acting as the bridge between heaven and earth. Moreover, Christians consider the Transfiguration to fulfill an Old Testament messianic prophecy that Elijah would return again after his ascension, Malachi 4, 5-6. This was taken from Gardner, 2015, page 218, states, "The very last of the writing prophets, Malachi, promised a return of Elijah to hold out hope for repentance before judgment. Malachi 4, verses 5-6. Elijah himself would appear in the Transfiguration. There he would appear alongside Moses as a representative of all the prophets who looked forward to the coming of the Messiah. Matthew 17, 2-9, Mark 9, 2-10, Luke 9, 28-36. Christ's redemptive sacrifice was the purpose for which Elijah had ministered while on earth, and it was the goal about which Elijah spoke to Jesus in the Transfiguration." Let's take a look at the New Testament accounts of the Transfiguration. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew 17, 1-8, Mark 9, 2-8, and Luke 9, 28-36, the account of the Transfiguration happens toward the middle of the narrative. It is a key episode, and almost immediately follows another important element, the confession of Peter. "You are the Christ," Matthew 16:16, Mark 8:29, and Luke 9:20. The Transfiguration narrative acts as a further revelation of the identity of Jesus as the Son of God to some of his disciples. In the Gospels, Jesus takes Peter, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John the Apostle with him, and goes up to a mountain, which is not named. Once in the mountain, Matthew 17:2 states that Jesus was transfigured before them, his face shining as the sun, and his garments become white as the light. At that point, the prophet Elijah, representing the prophets, and Moses, representing the law, appear, and Jesus begins to talk to them. Luke states that they spoke of Jesus' exodus, exodon, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem, Luke 9:31. Luke is also specific in describing Jesus in a state of glory, with Luke 9:32 referring to they saw his glory. Just as Elijah and Moses begin to depart from the scene, Peter begins to ask Jesus the disciples should make 3 tents for him and the 2 prophets. This has been interpreted as Peter's attempt to keep the prophets there longer. But before Peter can finish, a bright cloud appears, and a voice from the cloud states, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Mark 9:7. The disciples then fall to the ground in fear, but Jesus approaches and touches them, telling them not to be afraid. When the disciples look up, they no longer see Elijah or Moses. When Jesus and the 3 apostles are going back down the mountain, Jesus tells them to not tell anyone the things they had seen until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. The apostles are described as questioning among themselves as to what Jesus meant by risen from the dead. In addition to the principal account given in the Synoptic Gospels, in 2 Peter 1:16-18, the Apostle Peter describes himself as an eyewitness of his magnificence. Elsewhere in the New Testament, Paul the Apostle's reference in 2 Corinthians 3:18 to the transformation of believers via beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord became the theological basis for considering the Transfiguration as the catalyst for processes which lead the faithful to the knowledge of God. Although Matthew 17 lists the disciples, John, as being present during the Transfiguration, the Gospel of John has no account of it. This has resulted in debate among scholars, some suggesting doubts about the authorship of the Gospel of John, others providing explanation for it. One explanation that goes back to Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th century is that John wrote his Gospel not to overlap with the Synoptic Gospels, but to supplement it, and hence did not include all of their narrative. Others believe that the Gospel of John does in fact allude to the Transfiguration in John 1:14. This is not the only incident not present in the 4th Gospel, and the institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper is another key example, indicating that the author either was not aware of these narrative traditions, did not accept their veracity, or decided to omit them. The general explanation is thus the Gospel of John was written thematically to suit the author's theological purposes, and has a less narrative style than the Synoptics. How important is the Transfiguration? Let's talk about that for a minute. The mosaic of the Transfiguration on St. Catherine's Monastery, Mount Sinai. That's interesting. I've actually been there to Mount Sinai and St. Catherine's Monastery. Absolutely amazing. great deal of significance to the Transfiguration, based on multiple elements of the narrative. In Christian teachings, the Transfiguration is a pivotal moment, and the setting on the mountain is presented at the point where human nature meets God, the meeting place of the temporal and the eternal, with Jesus himself as the connecting point, acting as the bridge between heaven and earth. The Trinity not only supports the identity of Jesus as the Son of God, as in his baptism, but the statement, "Listen to him," identifies him as the messenger and mouthpiece of God. The significance of this identification is enhanced by the presence of Elijah and Moses, for it indicates to the apostles that Jesus is the voice of God par excellence, and instead of Moses or Elijah representing the law and the prophets, he should be listened to, surpassing the laws of Moses by virtue of his divinity and filial relationship with God. 2 Peter 1:16-18 echoes the same message. At the Transfiguration, God assigns to Jesus a special honor and glory, and it is the turning point at which God exalts Jesus above all other powers in creation and positions him as ruler and judge. Transfiguration also echoes the teaching by Jesus, as in Matthew 22:32, that God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Although Moses had died and Elijah had been taken up to heaven centuries before, as in 2 Kings 2:11, they now live in the presence of the Son of God, implying that the same return to life applies to all who face death and have faith. What about the location of the Transfiguration account? None of the accounts identify the high mountain of the scene by name. Since the 3rd century, some Christians have identified Mount Tabor as the site of the Transfiguration, including Origen. See footnote 38, citing Origen's reference to Psalms 89 verse 12. Tabor has long been a place of Christian pilgrimage and is the site of the Church of the Transfiguration. In 1808, Henry Alford cast doubt on Tabor due to the possible continuing Roman utilization of a fortress which Antiochus the Great built on Tabor in 219 BC. See reference 39. Others have countered that even if Tabor was fortified by Antiochus, this does not rule out a transfiguration at the summit. Josephus mentions in the Jewish War that he built a wall along the top perimeter in 40 days, and does not mention any previously existing structures. John is too far, but, I quote, some mountain near Caesarea Philippi, see reference 42 below. The usual candidate in this case is Mount Panium, Paneas, or Banias, a small hill situated at the source of the Jordan, near the foot of which Caesarea Philippi was built. William Hendrickson, in his commentary on Matthew 1973, favors Mount Meron, see reference 43. Whitaker 1984 proposes that it was Mount Nebo, primarily on the basis that it was the location where Moses viewed the Promised Land, and a parallelism in Jesus' words on descent from the mountain of Transfiguration. You will say to this mountain, for example the Transfiguration, move from here to there, the Promised Land, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. France, 1987, notes that Mount Hermon is closest to Caesarea Philippi, mentioned in the previous chapter of Matthew. Likewise, Mayboom, 1861, identified Jebel Ejik B, but this may be a confusion with Jabal el-Sheikh, the Arabic name for Mount Hermon. Edward Griswell, however, writing in 1830, saw, I quote, no good reason for questioning the ancient ecclesiastical tradition, which supposes it to have been Mount Tabor, reference 44 below. An alternative explanation is to understand the Mount of Transfiguration as symbolic typography in the Gospels. As Elizabeth Struthers Melbourne notes, the mountain is figuratively the meeting place between God and humans, reference 45, and therefore it is the ideal landscape for an epiphany or theophany, reference 46 below. Passages and references at the link for Wikipedia, The Transfiguration of Jesus. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day. I hope you can join Beyond Bethany Tours on one of its adventures to the Mount of Transfiguration in the Holy Land. Get in touch if you're interested. Thank you.